Hello, and welcome back to Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel. This is Lecture 2, Transmedia 101, or Overcoming Transmedia Resistance with Narrative Design for Fun and Profit. So, first off, let's start with the basics. So, what is transmedia? Well, the first thing to keep in mind is that transmedia is not a noun. It's an adjective. There are multiple types of transmedia experiences, such as transmedia marketing, transmedia activism, and transmedia storytelling, which is what we're going to be focusing on in this class. To get back to that notion, though, of what makes transmedia, the term was actually coined by this woman, Marcia Kinder, who was a professor at USC, in this book in 1993, Playing with Power, in which she was talking primarily about transmedia intertextuality. So, much like the way that my own experiences with transmedia were formed with these 1980s properties like Transformers, like I talked about in the introduction, Marcia was looking at these kind of 80s and 90s properties like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles that would span multiple media. And part of what Marcia was looking at was how this was the result of a change in the law. So, for most of the early years of children's television programming, there were very explicit laws in place that said that you could not basically do TV shows that were just ads. That there could be toys based on TV shows. So things like Howdy Doody would have replica dolls of Howdy Doody that would be sold. The selling of those dolls was not the core purpose of Howdy Doody until that law was changed, and that's what really paved the way for these kind of properties in the 1980s, which were not originating as an animated cartoon, but originating as a product line. So those are TV shows like G.I. Joe and Transformers, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, all those sorts of things. What would happen, Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, it might be an exception to that. But certainly with G.I. Joe and Transformers and My Little Pony and Care Bears and She-Ra and all that kind of stuff, they originated with this toy line, and then the studios, or the companies that were responsible for creating those toy lines, then did these deals with these animation companies to produce what were effectively serialized 30-minute ads, right? And then that same kind of licensing deal was then done for not just for cartoons, but for also comics and tie-in books and things like that. And what Marcia was looking at is how those kinds of properties would make that jump from cartoons into comics and so on and so forth. But what Marcia was really looking at was not necessarily this idea of a story that would flow from one medium to the other so much as it was a brand that would flow from one medium to the other. And that notion of intertextuality that she was looking at here deals with how those different instances of property like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles would exist in the books alongside the comics, alongside the TV show, and how those relationships between them, that's what she called intertextuality. So, where Henry built on that and really kind of cemented this idea of transmedia storytelling was specifically looking at those experiences where that intertextuality was very clearly designed and architected in order to connect one medium to the next, so that a transmedia story might start in a book and go on into a TV show and then go on into a comic book and so on and so forth, and a feature film and yada, yada, yada. So Henry's primary definition was that transmedia storytelling unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. So what does that mean? Well, part of this comes from this practice of media consolidation that was happening in the 90s. So the consolidation of, say, Disney, right? So when these deals originated, you would have Marvel or Hasbro that would do one deal with a movie company and one deal with a TV company and one deal with a comic company and one deal with a book company. And each one of those things were separate, right? But as you started getting these corporations that would then go buy other corporations outright, like when Disney bought Marvel, um, then suddenly there became this shift in what was basically known as vertical and horizontal integration across companies. So if you have one distinct deal with a game company and one distinct deal with a movie company, one distinct deal with a comic company, blah, 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 basically the CEO of that company that owns, that is just doing these licensing deals, the the overall performance of those licensing deals for him or her starts and stops with that original deal, right? If, however, you're Disney and now you own ABC as a TV company and Marvel as a comics company and so on and so forth, then there becomes a very real and super profitable deal, benefit to having one person, each individual audience member buy the comic book and buy the book and buy the TV show subscription on iTunes and buy the tickets to the movies, so that the longer that they can keep somebody in that ecosystem, buying more and more and more stuff, the more profitable that particular project becomes. So in Xbox, what we would do is, because the main profits to Microsoft came when somebody would buy a copy of like Halo 3 or whatever, right? If they bought it from Microsoft, Microsoft got the money. If they bought a used copy from GameStop, Microsoft got no money. So what we wound up doing, or at least part of why we were doing this, is we would produce stuff like webisodes, like Forward Unto Dawn, and we would produce things like Halo comic books and tie-in stuff like that. Even under traditional licensing deals, with this idea in mind that the longer that we could keep an audience engaged in Halo, the more likely that they were, or the more unlikely that they were, I should say, to sell that game copy back to GameStop. So the name of the initiative was to keep the disc in the tray as long as humanly possible, right? So to keep them from selling that game, to keep it in their Xbox. So, and really what that was it was a system of developing subscriptions, of developing ongoing relationships with these kinds of fans that we just keep them coming back and coming back and coming back and coming back. The general rule of thumb is that it is 7 times harder to get a new consumer, to get a new audience member, than it is to keep an old one. Right? So, or 7 times easier to keep one than it is to get a new one. So again, that's sort of why we would have this transition towards more of a subscription philosophy, towards an ongoing relationship with the audience. So the second thing of this is that as all media become digital, media experiences will become increasingly interconnected. This is what I was talking about in the introduction, about when I was pivoting over to doing research for Ray Ozzie about whether transmedia storytelling was native entertainment for the cloud. We've seen this already taking shape with Disney Plus, right? Disney Plus, DC Universe Online. Even 5-10 years ago, and even before that, we were already looking at these trends where physical comic books were starting to be replaced by digital comic books, and physical books are starting to be, if not replaced per se, at the very least significantly augmented with ebooks and so on. And so when you start making this pivot, as we're seeing right now, with Disney actually coming out and saying a week ago, 2 weeks ago, that their main business model was pivoting away from theatrical movies and away from regular TV shows to producing content for Disney Plus. That is now their new main area of focus. It's really the acceptance that digital media is becoming the primary medium of focus, and they're shifting more towards that subscription mentality. So just the same way as I was talking about, getting people to think about subscribing, so to speak, to Halo. Now you have people that are subscribing to Disney Plus, and it would shock me a bit nor a twiddle if eventually you had people that were subscribing specifically to a Marvel sub package of Disney Plus, or a Star Wars sub package of Disney Plus, or maybe even an add-on package for those kind of properties moving forward. DC Universe did an interesting experiment where they had not just the TV shows and the movies, the video content for for DC, but they also have a comic book package, right? So if you subscribe to DC Universe, you would get all the video stuff, and then you would also get all the comics. That has just recently started to come to an end, as Warner Brothers is shifting all that DC video content away from DC Universe over into HBO Max, and they're leaving the DC Universe as the platform for digital comic book reading. But the hypothesis that I have here, that we had at Microsoft, and that I maintain is more likely to be the case moving forward, is when you get these platforms that are developed to deliver multiple content types, so not just video, but also comics or ebooks, even if it's through one shared login, for some platform like Amazon, right? So that you can have these sort of implicit links made explicit that connect one form of video or one form of content to another, going out through the rest of the ecosystem, then that kind of buy-in mentality, that kind of lock-in approach is just going to get deeper and deeper, right? So if you just watch the say the Batman Gotham by Gaslight, or better yet, the new season of Harley Quinn, right? So if you go out and watch the new season of Harley Quinn on HBO Max, if it is tied into the larger system, that it prompts you to then say, hey, want to know more about Harley Quinn's history? Watch these episodes of Batman the Animated Series when she first showed up, and then read these particular comics, which are the main bits of Harley Quinn's story, or play this particular level in the latest Batman Arkham game, or the new Suicide Squad game that's coming out, which has Harley as a main character. Those kinds of connections are very much the kind of intertextuality, the transmedia intertextuality that Marcia Kinder was talking about. But instead of it being just sort of maintained in the user's mind, it then suddenly becomes maintained in the platform itself. Right? Again, the implicit made explicit, and the more that is made explicit, the more of a value proposition it offers for people to remain subscribed to that kind of transmedia platform, which I am willing to bet is exactly where Disney Plus is heading. Right. Now, part of the reason why this is happening now, or a third key reason why this is happening now, is because audiences are now thinking differently about media experiences, partly because of the ubiquity of high-speed internet. You couldn't do Disney Plus when the internet, when getting on the internet sounded like you were murdering a robot at 14.4K or 28.8K or 56K, which I am sure just sailed all over your heads, because I am an old and you are not. But back in the old days of the internet, it used to be that you had to connect to the internet using a phone, not like an iPhone. You actually had to, call a service provider, and it sounded like whatever, right? Some of you, I hope to God, are old enough to have gotten that joke. Anyway, but now that the internet stuff flow like water in the vast majority of at least American metropolitan areas, and with the broadband initiative gaining steam, even more rural places are starting to get gigabit internet access, and as 5G continues to roll out, then high-speed internet over wireless connections is going to become increasingly ubiquitous. Anyway, point being that kind of always-on connectivity is kind of rewiring our brains, right? I mean, those of you that grew up with Pokemon and grew up with these kind of properties that are inherently transmedia, then to y'all it's water to a fish, right? Of course, Star Wars exists across the feature films, and then spins off into these Clone Wars TV shows, and then spins off again into these tie-in comics and novels and things. This is just the world, to y'all. when I was a kid, it was not that straightforward, as I talked about a little bit in the introduction. Yeah, anyway. So basically, this is going from a remarkable state of affairs into the default state of affairs. However, just because it's the default doesn't mean it's always done well. And so part of what we're going to be looking at here is, well, how to do it well. So, like I said in the introduction, when I was at Microsoft, I was looking at these, kind of transmedia case studies, right? And so I identified over 40 of those at the time that we actually turned into these written case studies. But I was keeping a much larger list at the same time of things that we might want to look at, things that had very clearly transmedia elements associated with them. And I had over 500 known properties on that list that could be deemed as transmedia. And that was like 7 years ago that I did this, right? So this is just becoming increasingly ubiquitous as more and more of these properties show up. So let's go back to Henry's thing. Like I said, okay. Transmedia storytelling unfolds across multiple media platforms, with each new text making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. Tear that apart, right? So first off, when we say makes a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole, we're not talking about adaptation. A adaptation is when a story is basically moved from one medium into another. And that is like a basic retelling, right? There's always going to be stuff that changes. Let's not get that confused. The idea that something is a direct lift from one medium to the other very rarely happens. When you make that jump from TV into from a book into a TV show, for example, the way that the story is told is going to be different based on the unique affordances or characteristics of each medium, and we'll get back to that much later in the class. But suffice it to say that it's still the same story with the same major plot beats and the same major characters, just retold in a different medium. A transmedia story, however, tells distinct components, has distinct retellings of each thing, right? Or distinct chapters exist across distinct media. So the first chapter might be told as a book, the second chapter might be told as a movie, the third chapter might be told as a video game, and so on and so forth. The other thing to look at is whether something is considered distinctive and valuable. So a Star Wars serial just adds to your waistline. It's not the same thing as a Star Wars novel that actually adds to your understanding of how that story world works, of how those different characters work, with what happened at a particular point in that story world. It really adds to your understanding of the overall experience. So, traditionally, a story that originated in movies would be told across 3 movies, right? You have your first movie, your second movie, your third movie, and depending on the popularity of the of the franchise, that was usually what you got. But then with transmedia, you might have a cartoon that is released as a prequel or as an advertising campaign leading up to the first feature film, then goes on to a second cartoon, then goes back to a second feature film. They might go on into a video game, then into a third feature film, then on into another video game, which, not coincidentally, happens to be precisely the pattern that the Wachowski sisters used when they produced The Matrix. So, according to legend, what happened was that the Wachowskis produced the original Matrix film, and they had some ideas as to where it could go from there, and they had definitely spent a bunch of time developing the lore and the history of that world. But they figured out exactly what they needed to tell in that very first film and have it be standalone awesome. When it worked, and Warner Brothers came back to the Wachowskis and said, "Here's all the money in the universe. Where do you want to go from here?" They sat down, I think it was on a plane ride, was when they first started hashing this thing out. And they sketched out this plan, this transmedia plan, for how this larger story would unfold, not just across 2 subsequent movies, but across all these other transmedia extensions as well. So the Animatrix was originally released as a series of animated shorts that were produced by the leading anime directors from Japan. and they were put out online as part of an advertising campaign leading up to the release of The Matrix Reloaded. Enter the Matrix was a video game for the PlayStation 2 that when they were shooting The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, they actually shot a whole bunch of extra scenes with those actors and actresses for that game. So because they had the plan already for what that story was going to be, they were able to actually capture additional footage to make that story much richer with the actual voices and character animated types from the actors and actresses from the movie. And then The Matrix Online was an MMORPG, right? A massively multiplayer online role-playing game, kind of like World of Warcraft, that was put out that continued the story on after the end of the third movie. Now, the interesting thing about that was that the decisions that the players made in that story world were considered canonical, right? So it wasn't just an optional thing. If a character died in the MMO based on character actions, then they were dead in the world of the Matrix, and that's exactly what happened with Morpheus, Lawrence Fishburne's character. And so it'll be fascinating to see because now the Wachowskis are producing a fourth film in the Matrix quadrilogy, I guess I should say. How much of that they're going to continue to integrate, like whether they'll stick to their guns and still have Morpheus be dead the same way that he died in the MMO, or if they're going to backtrack on that. So, long story short, you could more or less understand the story of the Matrix if you only watched the 3 movies. But you had a much better experience if you actually consumed all of it. Now, we'll come back to this later. But this is, again, a design challenge, right? And one of the things that the Wachowskis did that was arguably suboptimal was there was a bunch of the story that was told in the Animatrix that made the ending of the third Matrix movie make way more sense. There were particular bits of the plot in the third Matrix movie that basically didn't make sense, like at all, unless you had watched these animated shorts. And the fact that it was not that clear that that was how you were supposed to consume this entire franchise, that a whole bunch of people were left with a bad taste in their mouths. And so that was arguably, well, for starters, it was way too early for its time. But it was an over-reliance on those kinds of extensions that made for a bad design choice. Now, when we talk about transmedia, another thing to keep in mind is that even in transmedia storytelling, as opposed to transmedia marketing and transmedia branding and so on and so forth, is that there are multiple schools of thought. So Andrea Phillips is this brilliant game designer, novelist, theorist person. She, and a friend of mine, cool. Andrea wrote this book called The Creator's Guide to Transmedia Storytelling, and in it, she wrote up this bit of history where some guys that were the sort of leading pranksters of the transmedia space, back when this was first taking shape back in the early 2000s. What Brian Clark, God rest his soul, he passed away a couple of years ago, and Steve Peters, who's a big alternate reality game designer, did was they created this sort of mental model that described an East Coast versus West Coast battle, kind of like East Coast versus West Coast rappers. That was what they were riffing on, and it was largely a joke, but it still had enough power to it, like enough truth to it, that Andrea wrote it up, and it actually made a lot of sense. So, according to this theory, West Coast transmedia storytelling, it's called West Coast because this is where, Hollywood and, Microsoft Studios and Nintendo, all of us are here on the West Coast. So, these are the kind of big transmedia franchises that are based primarily on big pre-recorded feature films, TV shows, books, stuff like that, right? Big Hollywood franchise style storytelling, big business commercial storytelling. Now, that's sort of what this looks like, right? So the Matrix is very much made up of East Coast style storytelling. Contrast that to, West Coast is that particular mentality. Contrast that to East Coast, which is much more like live theater, because it is inspired much more by the kind of experimental theater stuff that was happening in Broadway in New York, and also the kind of advertising campaigns that were coming out of New York as well. So East Coast transmedia storytelling is much more web centric. So alternate reality games are very much a kind of East Coast kind of thing. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, an alternate reality game is this sort of large scale, one part theater, one part advertising campaign. They're usually done in support of some big feature film release, where the company that puts them on releases the story in bits across things like YouTube videos and Twitter streams and live events, right? And we'll come back to this in a little bit. But these had a much heavier reliance on new media, like on internet distributed stuff. But this is the kind of thing that only happened once, because it was much more like a 1950s art, like a happening sort of a thing. And so you can look at the rise of escape rooms here over the last, 10 years, as an attempt by the alternate reality game industry to sub-industry, to come up with a way of making those kind of alternate reality games repeatable. So they took a page out of theme park design and basically built these little pop-up escape rooms as these immersive experiences. Because the biggest thing about an alternate reality game was this idea that it is not a game, right? It was an immersive story experience. And the thing was always very kind of fast and loose about telling people whether or not it was fictional, right? Hence the alternate reality. Anyway, so this is really what an East Coast transmedia story would tend to look like. Now, you'll notice something here that is crucially important. What is the biggest thing that these two kinds of storytelling have in common? It's the little blue arrows, right? So that ability to connect two pieces of media, whether it's a YouTube channel to a website, onto a Twitter account, or if it's to connect a cartoon into a movie back into another cartoon, that is a thing that can be designed. That is at the heart of transmedia, the sort of transmission or transmit or the transportation of an audience from one bit of media into another. So I'll let you in on a dirty little secret here too, which is if you can figure out how to send people from one bit of media into another in a really good and interesting and engaging and playful way, well, this is not only the secret to developing really good transmedia experiences, it's a secret to developing really good interconnected media experiences, even when it's all in the same medium. So what you'll see is that same kind of game design practices that go into developing a transmedia story are also at the heart of why something like the Marvel Cinematic Universe works, right? The ability to send audiences from one Iron Man movie into another Captain America movie, into a Thor movie, and on into the Avengers, and so on and so forth, right? That is a design practice. That is something that can be learned. It is a skill that can be honed, and that's largely what y'all are going to be learning how to do in this class. Now, so how do you do that? How do you what goes into the design of each of these little blue arrows, right? Well, it's not as complicated as you might think. So each blue arrow is indicative of the sort of four-step process, right? Discover, collect, consume, react. So every time that you make the jump from one media component into another, you go through these four steps. So how did somebody first find out that this other piece of media exists? This is a lot harder than you might think. If you go and you binge a whole bunch of like TV shows on Netflix, it makes it super easy to flow into the next episode of the show, because that's what Netflix has in its system, and it will default over into playing the next episode of the show. But if there's a comic book that you're supposed to read in between, like episodes 8 and 9 of a particular show, or if the show ends but then is continued on in a comic books, Netflix ain't going to tell you to stop watching Netflix and go read this comic book. It's the kind of thing that Disney Plus and DC Universe may very well do sooner or later. But so far, that is not something that we are It is not something that the platforms are designed to support. So you've got to figure out ways in order to communicate out to your audience that these additional pieces of media exist. Second, collect it, right? How does somebody get it? Again, as media become increasingly digital and increasingly connected, that act of collection is becoming easier, but it's still not entirely as easy as it could be. Consume is asking what kind of literacy is assumed when this kind of additional media exists, right? So it might be easy to read a book. It might be easy to watch a TV show. If you play a video game, however, you looked at a game controller lately? Like a usual Xbox or PlayStation controller has like, what? 16 buttons on it. So to make the jump like Lost did from a TV show into a video game assumes a level of literacy with even being able to play that game that a lot of Lost fans might not have. Especially if you're an older fan, you're not really much of a gamer. So you have to take into consideration what you're asking your people, your audiences to know how to do. And finally, then what do? Right? What's the next call to action? Do you use marketing language? When you're done reading something, or when you're done playing something, or when you're done watching something, are you supposed to then talk about it online? Are you supposed to watch the next episode? Are you supposed to read the next comic book? Like, what is that next step? What is the reaction that you're trying to get your audience to do? Now, what you'll notice is as you say these things over and over and over again, discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react. It sounds like a train, right? And that's deliberate. So as somebody makes the jump from one piece of media to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, and then to the next, what they're doing is they're building up momentum, sort of the way that a train builds up steam. And so the more that they do this, the deeper ingrained that they get into that franchise, the more embedded, or the more invested, I should say, that they are in that franchise, the less likely they are to, say, sell that Halo disc back to GameStop, right? So if you think about it this way, if you think about the ways that you are developing this ongoing, deepening relationship with your audience, it is very clearly a design challenge. It is very clearly an experience design challenge that you are being asked to do. So the problem, though, is that everyone has an inherent trouble with transmedia, right? And that's really simple. Henry points out in Convergence Culture in Transmedia 101, actually one of his blog posts on it, that the way that this has traditionally been done, without a kind of clear design architecture in place to refer people to recommend a comic book after you're done watching the TV show episode on Netflix or whatever, in the absence of that, what exists is this sort of vast hunting and gathering game where for me to know that I should go watch all these episodes of the Clone Wars, between the second and third Star Wars prequels, right? That's not exactly obvious. So that's work, right? It's work to go out and find all this extra stuff. It's work to discover it. It's work to collect it. It's work to consume it. Dudes, I subscribe to the Ben & Jerry school of thought, which is, if it's not fun, why do it, right? I'm a game designer, at least in part. And so for me, you've got to figure out ways in order to make this fun. This is not an achievement you ever want to see, right? Memorizing an entire Star Wars universe is the pinnacle of nerddom. You never want to say to somebody, well, the Star Wars movies are great, but really they're so much better if you just go and read all these books and you read all these comic books and you play all these video games and people are lazy, dudes, right? People are going to look at you like you're nuts because this is a homework assignment, right? If somebody tells you that the whole Matrix thing only makes sense if you do all this other stuff, you're going to get that crazy baby look. Right? Skeptical baby. People are lazy. People are fat. People want stuff to be easy. They want it to be fun. So that's where we get back to this challenge of how do you overcome that inherent resistance of discover, collect, consume, react at every step of that process being at least some degree of work, man. Well, this is my mom. My mom is cooler than I am. And it pains me to say that. But the reason why my mom is cooler than I am is because she actually was into Buffy the Vampire Slayer before I ever was. I thought the whole premise of Buffy the Vampire Slayer was absurd when I first heard about it. And in the abstract, it is. A cheerleader is the chosen one to go out and slay the vampires. The cheerleader was usually the first up on the buffet line for said vampires. Come on. But in actuality, to have Buffy the Vampire Slayer be a reimagining of vampire mythos using the kind of the girl that you would think of as Bait as a very super feminist hero was remarkably profound. Anyway, so my mom turned me on to Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So like I said, she's cooler than I ever was and ever will be. I digress. So mom was a huge Buffy fan, right? Well, Dark Horse came back and continued Buffy the Vampire Slayer after the TV show was over into this transmedia continuation of the story in comic books. And they brought Joss Whedon back to tell those stories, and it was the canonical continuation. It was literally the season 8 that picked up where season 7 left off, right? And so my mom would have loved this story. There's only one huge problem, and that's despite all the kind of familial resemblance that I might have with Comic Book Guy is actually a huge bit of resistance, standing between, my mom and Buffy the Vampire Slayer comics. I do not want my mom to have to deal with Comic Book Guy. Digital media is making this easier, right? So now, with Amazon, mom can just go, buy those trade paperbacks and have them delivered to her house. Comixology, she could actually buy the digital versions of those comics and have them pushed to an iPad or a Kindle, right? All these things are ways of which this is being made easier, right? It is a way of overcoming that kind of resistance. Now, those are ways of overcoming the friction of collecting it, right? But the other way of overcoming resistance is not just by decreasing friction, it's also by increasing energy. So by increasing the value of that tie-in comic more than a traditional licensing thing, right? There were Buffy comics that were being published when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was first on the air, and they weren't that important, right? A character could get killed off in the comic books and still be running around alive in the TV show for the same reason that those traditional licensing deals with Transformers that I was bitching about in the last the last lecture. But the shift towards a transmedia approach, where it was canonical, it really was blessed by Joss Whedon, the showrunner, the creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and seen as how that story, quote unquote, really continues, that would increase the amount of energy, the amount of time and money that my mom would have been willing to invest in getting those additional comics, right? So that's how Dark Horse was able to overcome transmedia resistance, right? By putting stuff into more digital formats or making it available for ordering online, and B, to make it more narratively valuable by having it be written by the same showrunners, the same storytellers responsible for the TV show, and having it be the canonical, yes, this really happens, next part of that story. So, in short, transmedia resistance is overcome by making things easier or making people more excited to do it. Discover, collect, consume, react, discover, collect, consume, react. Each one of these stages, right? If you make things easier to discover, collect, consume, react, or make people more excited to discover, collect, consume, react, that's how you're going to overcome that kind of transmedia resistance, right? So, how do you do that? Overcoming the inherent friction through digital delivery, that's at a kind of meta level. But designing the story world in such a way that it makes people more excited to discover, collect, and consume, react, to make people more invested in that story world, to make people fall in love with it, right? That's where this comes in, this idea of transmedia aesthetics. Transmedia aesthetics is basically a study of beauty, right? So if you look at a well-designed experience, it is fun, it is elegant, it is painless to experience, right? And so that's where this idea of transmedia aesthetics as a design practice is going to come in. So, beautiful transmedia stories use narrative design techniques, remember the narrative design team, to decrease friction or increase energy, thus reducing transmedia resistance. And so, this is the stuff that this class is going to be working through here over the next couple of weeks with an individual lecture dedicated to each one of these 10 high-level transmedia aesthetics. Okay? So, that's really what I want you guys to be thinking about. One assignment that I want each of you to do now that you kind of have this thought in your head about how transmedia stories are stories that unfold across multiple media, with each component making a distinctive and valuable contribution to the whole. I want you to tell me what your favorite transmedia story world is. Right? I want you to come back to class on Thursday and tell us, like, is it Star Wars? Is it Star Trek? Is it Assassin's Creed? Is it football? Like, what kind of stories do you follow across multiple media? And if possible, think about those 4 stages: discover, collect, consume, react. If you could tell us, like, and where you saw those at play, like how did you first discover that Assassin's Creed spun out into comic books, or that Transformers would then go on into a particular video game that was an actual next part of the story? So how did you discover it? How did you collect it? How did you consume it? And then what do you think it was prompting you to do after you were done? How were you invited to react to it? So that's the big key assignment. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in class.